Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, I should say, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Dr. Imogen DL, and I am the Programme Coordinator for the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this event, Manfred Goldberg, My Death March Experience. This is the last event in our Death Marches Evidence and Memory series, which is running alongside an exhibition of the same name that is currently on display at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London and the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre on the University of Huddersfield campus. You can find recordings of all the events from this series, including this one in a few days' time, on our YouTube channel. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we get started. There will be time for questions from the audience towards the end of the event. Please write any questions that you do have in the chat box and we will do our best to answer these. We ask that all attendees keep themselves on mute for the duration of the event, but you're more than welcome to keep your camera on because only speakers' video will appear in the recording. We are using automatic closed captioning for this event, and you can turn this on at the bottom of your screen. As this is auto-generated, despite the technology being quite good, it doesn't always accurately reflect everything that's being said, so we do apologise for any inconvenience this might cause. And also that I will be adding some of the key terms and place names that come up in the course of conversation in the chat box on Zoom, in case you would like to look these up after the event. And we will also have some visuals, some maps as part of this event as well to better illustrate what our speakers are saying. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the chair for this event, Professor Dan Stone. Professor Stone is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, the University of London. Alongside my colleague, Dr. Christine Schmidt, he is also the co-curator of the Death Marches Evidence and Memory exhibition. Professor Stone is a historian of ideas who works primarily on 20th century European history. His research interests include the history and interpretation of the Holocaust, comparative genocide, history of anthropology, history of fascism, the cultural history of the British Right, and theory of history. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Imogen, and welcome everybody to this final event in the Death March series. Actually, what we're going to hear about today is rather different from anything we've covered so far, and it's also unique in the history of the Holocaust. What you're going to hear about from Manfred Goldberg today is better called a death march at sea or a maritime evacuation. It's something that was highly unusual and a very particular phenomenon within the context of the Holocaust. And it's a great pleasure for me and a real honor to be able to introduce Manfred Goldberg, who's going to speak to us about his experiences during the evacuations from Stutthof in April 1945. So Manfred Goldberg was born in Kassel in central Germany in 1930. His parents came from Poland to Germany a decade or so before that. In 1939, his father was arrested and deported to Poland, but sent back to a concentration camp in Germany. He was allowed to leave as long as he left Germany immediately, which he did for the UK, leaving behind his wife and Manfred and his younger brother Hermann. In December 1941, they were arrested and sent to Riga, to the Riga ghetto. And from there, in August 1943, as part of a group of about 1,000 inmates, they were transported to the Preču labor camp, where they worked at a railway junction repairing bombed railway tracks. In August 1944, he and his mother, his young brother, had then been taken away and presumed murdered, were then sent to Stutthof just on the Baltic coast in what's today Poland for about 3 weeks, then sent to the Stolp labor camp, and then sent back first to Burggraben labor camp, and then back to Stutthof. It's a complicated story, and I'd like to, before we get to the Death March experience, I'd like to start by asking Manfred if you could just speak briefly. I know it's a terrible thing to ask you, but to speak briefly about the period that I've just described up until the point at which you were in Stutthof.
Well, thank you very much. I will speak about this period very briefly because your primary interest is about the death marches, and as we are time constrained, I will just speak quite cursorily about the period you've asked me to describe. Soon after we arrived in Riga, incidentally, immediately on our arrival in Riga, we were put on a starvation diet, which continued relentlessly for 3.5 years until the day of our liberation. It very soon after our arrival became clear to us that the main reason we were permitted to live in Riga was for the Nazis to exploit us as slave laborers, because everyone over the age of 13 had to report every morning. People were divided into work groups, and under armed guard were marched into nearby factories to manufacture goods to assist the German war effort. Anyone who began weakening was on an individual basis just taken to an execution site, shot, and their body dumped in a mass grave. A mere 3 months after our arrival, there was a mass selection, which meant no one was going to work. We were marched in groups into a nearby hall, had to shuffle forward single file until each one of us faced an SS officer who would glance cursorily at the person standing before him, and then, usually without saying a word, pointed left or right. And it very soon became evident that all the elderly, infirm, and disabled people were pointed in one direction, and younger, healthy-looking people were pointed in the opposite direction. The Nazis lied and told us that these elderly people were being sent to another camp where the work would be much easier. In fact, it became clear just days later when truckloads of clothing were returned to the Riga ghetto and sorters were selected to go through the clothing, sort it, and some of the sorters recognized items of clothing which had been worn by their loved ones the day they were sent away, ostensibly to another camp, and it became clear to us that they had been forced to strip before they were murdered. Incidentally, the Riga ghetto had been occupied by 30,000 Riga Jews before we arrived, who were all murdered en masse in around 1 week. All 30,000 had been murdered. It was a major extermination or program on the Nazis' part. Instead of being marched into another camp, as they had been told, they were taken in groups into a nearby forest where they were shot, and they're buried to this day in 3 mass graves. That was life in Riga. As already mentioned, we were sent to the next camp, Preču, where, as has already again been mentioned, many people worked in factories again to produce goods to assist the Nazi war effort. But my mother and I became part of a group of about 300 who were marched out daily to a nearby very busy rail junction, which was regularly bombed by the Allies because they realized this was a vital junction which the Nazis used to supply materials and reinforcements to the Russian war front. We were set to work digging up bomb-damaged rails, fill in bomb craters, and eventually relay new rails to make the line serviceable again. We spent a whole year in this camp, and from beginning to end of that year, we worked constantly, day after day, 7 days a week, repairing bomb-damaged rails. Because as we repaired one bomb-damaged section, the Allies returned, bombed again. So it was ongoing. as we repaired, they bombed. At the end of 1 year, precisely 1 year, we arrived in August 1943. In August 1944, we were packed into cattle trucks and transported to the concentration camp of Stutthof. Stutthof was known as a death camp. The entrance gate was known as the death gate, because once you entered Stutthof through that gate, there was a very, very limited chance that you would ever walk out alive. You would either work to death, or as Stutthof now possessed a gas chamber and a crematorium, you might be gassed to death, or you might even just die of starvation or ill health. But very few people made it out alive. Our group of 300 became the envy of the camp when it became known that we were being sent on to another labor camp. And indeed, after several weeks in Stutthof, again by sort of cattle wagons, we were transported to our next labor camp, Stolp, which has already been mentioned, where we again were set to work on repairing bomb-damaged rails. And it's more than likely that the skill we had gained in the first camp, working for 1 year doing this work, helped save our lives by us being selected to leave Stutthof alive. We had become a valuable source of labor because rail transportation was vital to the German war effort. And as we had become skilled at repairing bomb-damaged rails, we became a valuable source of slave labor for the Nazis. As I said, we continued doing the same work in a different camp now. Life was as difficult as ever. Starvation was constant, whichever camp we were in, from, as I said, from the moment we arrived until we were liberated. I became part of a gang who had to carry rails from the storage depot to the point where they were needed, the bomb-damaged area. 6 of us had to load one of these heavy rails onto our shoulders and walk it to the point where it was needed. Because we had to walk quite a distance, guards were posted along the route to keep an eye on us, just in case any of us had an idea of possibly escaping. And the guards amused themselves by holding long wooden sticks with a sharp nail nailed through the top end of that stick. And as we passed by, they lashed out at us. If they managed to hit us, of course, they would lacerate the skin. And I was sort of young and fairly agile. I was in fact 14 years old at the time. I had to begin work when I was 13, which probably also helped to save my life. There was just one occasion when I was hit, and I have to this day 2 scars, which I will carry for the rest of my life. We also experienced another selection where we had to strip naked this time before facing the SS man who selected us. As we shuffled forward, I was whispered to by the man behind me in line, if by chance he asks you your age, say you're 17. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. As prompted, I replied 17 when he asked my age. And I was pointed in the direction of those surviving this particular selection. At least one had a fair chance of staying alive, possibly till the next selection, unless anything untoward, which one had no control over, happened before. In this camp, many trains stopped for sort of rearrangement of wagons. Wagons were uncoupled from one train, coupled to another, and the rumor began to spread that some of these wagons contained food destined for troops at the front line. And indeed, on one occasion, some inmates broke the seal on one of these wagons and found some food, helped themselves, of course, to assuage their hunger pains. Hunger pain is something which is very difficult for people to take aboard. But the vast majority, I hope all of you, have never ever experienced this, but it becomes all sort of possessive. You cannot think straight. Your empty stomach craves for some sustenance, and it takes complete control of your mind. And this was ongoing, hour after hour, day after day, for years. Well, as a result of the crime committed by these inmates to helping themselves to some food, 8 men were taken away as hostages, and eventually we all had to assemble around the large gallows and watch these 8 men being hanged. Shortly thereafter, we were again taken in cattle trucks to our next camp, where we stayed for just under 3 weeks. But it was an extraordinary experience for me personally, because on the first morning, as we all had to assemble, as we did regularly in each camp, so for morning roll call, the SS officer told me to stay here when everyone is dismissed. And eventually, he took me to his accommodation and told me that I had become his, he called it a valet, but effectively I was his personal slave. I had to obey his orders, all for his personal needs. I had to look after his accommodation, polish all his boots, brush his uniforms, do dozens of different things to keep him satisfied. I trembled while I worked, but self-evidently I worked to the best of my ability, because he had it within his powers to either arrange for me to be murdered or possibly murder me himself without any slightest consequence for him. Jewish lives, in fact, any lives of any inmate in the camps, was worthless. There was never any question asked. Any trigger-happy guard could have any number of souls on his conscience without any consequence. As I said, after almost 3 weeks in this camp, in this extraordinary situation of having direct contact with a high-ranking SS officer, whose name I do not know, we were in cattle trucks transported back to Stutthof. It was by now early in 1945, and life in Stutthof had become pretty chaotic. Some days there was no food at all. Some days there was food, and if you were quick and managed to join the queue early on, you might be lucky and get a ladle full of some sort of colored water, which they called soup. Occasionally you'd find a bit of potato peel, never potatoes, potato peel, carrot peel, the outer leaves of cabbages, which we'd normally take off to throw away, that they were floating in that colored water. And that was our main warm sustenance. In the mornings, if we were lucky, we got a slice of bread and some ersatz coffee. And that is what we were fed on. I must have had the type of metabolism that managed to adjust to this. And obviously I didn't look as I look now, skin and bone, but managed to keep going. My mother and I were in separate camps in Stutthof. There was a barbed wire fence separating the men and ladies camps. And this visit was actually the beginning of the death march. As I said, life was so dreadful that people died daily. Every night, people died in their bunks. We usually had to share a bunk, 2 or 3 in a bunk by now, because Stutthof was so overcrowded. Every morning, a group was ordered to check every bunk and lift out any bodies, which were then put outside, where they were picked up, taken to the crematorium for burning. In late April 1945, one morning, we all had to line up, and a group of us was selected to be marched out of the ghetto. They were each given a chunk of bread and we were told to march. We then found that the same thing had happened in the ladies' camp adjoining, and there were two columns marching out of the camp, men and a column of ladies. Neither my mother nor I knew whether the other was included in this march. So as we began marching, it was possible for the men and ladies to begin mixing, and I began to make my way through the ladies' column to search whether I could find my mother. I don't know how long I searched, and my mother likewise began looking for me, and eventually we met up. And extraordinarily, although neither of us knew what our fate was intended to be, what we were facing ahead, we were very happy to be united and at least be destined to face together whatever was ahead for us. We marched for several hours and we reached a port, and there were several barges lined up. We were sort of quite violently forced into one of these barges. I think there were around 1,000 of us or so. The barge was packed tight. As I reached the hold of the barge low down, I was ordered to open my legs wide so that the next person could sit close to me, in front of me, so their body leaning against me. They in turn had to open their legs, and we were sort of stacked in line. And that was more or less the position we were stuck in for 6 days on the barges. Incidentally, during those 6 days, we were not given a scrap of food nor a sip of water, neither. Stuck in this position. I can only speak for the barge I was on, that at some point every day, an SS man would appear at the top of the barge, glance down, and the first thing he did was to sort of glance around and pick out 6 fairly young persons, asked each of them to stand up, and then told them, "You're under my command now, you will do exactly as I order you." He would then glance around and decide on one particular person. He asked that group of 6 to get hold of that person, I should say victim, and drag them up onto the top deck, which they did regardless of reaction from that person. And then, of course, we could not see what happened, but we could hear a scream and a splash. On his orders, that victim was thrown overboard to drown. He would then order the group down again, look around, select a second victim, and the same routine was followed. And on a daily basis, around 20-25 people lost their lives in that manner. Occasionally, the convoy, I assumed that it was a convoy as we were traveling along, we stopped, and we thought that we would now be unloaded and face whatever was in store for us. But after stopping for a while, the convoy would continue. After 6 days, I think it was day 7, the convoy stopped and we didn't continue. Eventually, it became clear that the tugs which had been towing our barges were not motorized. Each one was towed by a tug, which was manned by an SS team, I believe. The tugs had disappeared and had left us at sea. Rumors began going around the barge that they'd gone off to get some dynamite to try and blow us up, to finally get rid of us. And the group of around 1,000 on our barge were not entirely Jewish. I should think possibly half, it was 50-50. There were quite a few a proportion of non-Jewish prisoners as well, including some Scandinavians who, I'm not sure whether I'm correct, I think they were prisoners of war. Anyway, they were prisoners, whether they had been soldiers, because I don't know why Scandinavian soldiers should be fighting the Nazis, but there were a number of Scandinavians on our barge. A group of them clambered on top deck, and the message came down. We couldn't see anything. We were deep down in the hold of this boat, that we were not far from shore, actually, that they could see the shore quite clearly. And apparently we were perhaps a kilometer or so from shore. And this group of Scandinavians, who incidentally were in much better physical shape than any of the Jews. I didn't know that at the time, but I had occasion later, I don't know whether I have an opportunity to tell you, I returned to Stutthof in 2017, and Stutthof now is a walk-through museum. And in walking through this museum, I found that in the form of letters posted on a wall, that there had been 3 different types of diet in Stutthof. The Jews received the real starvation diet. The non-Jewish inmates received a better diet, and prisoners of war received a quite reasonable diet, possibly because on their behalf that the International Red Cross might have intervened. I don't know the reason, but these Scandinavians who went up on top deck, I think, have been fed with a better diet and therefore still had some strength and willpower left in them. And they decided quite extraordinarily that they would attempt to move this barge towards shore. And the message came down that they had actually prized loose some planks of wood and formed themselves into a rowing team. And they had also attempted to put up some sails using some bits of clothing to steer the barge towards shore. And this attempt went on for hour after hour. The Nazis had disappeared, weren't there to intervene. They appeared to have abandoned us. Night came, and when that team was exhausted, others took their place, and they kept on attempting to steer it to shore until well into the night, not long before dawn. It actually ran aground close to the shore. And the only way to get off the barge would be to clamber up onto the deck, jump into the water, and wade ashore. It was a very, very dark night. There was no moon, and there was no sign of habitation on shore either. All we could see was a large expanse of sandy shore. My mother had to persuade me to jump. I was a bit scared. I was just turned 15 at the time. It was days after my 15th birthday, but we held hands and we jumped and we waded ashore. And quite a number of others also did, but not everyone. Quite a few people were either so weak that they didn't have the physical strength, or they didn't have the willpower. They might have lost the will to live, as some people have done in Stutthof. They deliberately exposed themselves by going near the fence. They would be shot by guards from the guard tower, willfully, to end their suffering. In the same manner, I think some people just remain sitting on the barge, deciding, well, whatever life has in store for me, I'm not going to fight against it. What will happen will happen. and sadly it did. As I said, quite a group of us waded ashore, and since there was no sign of habitation visible to us, of course, people began discussing which way should we run, which way is safety, left, right, ahead, we just didn't know. And while this was happening, suddenly Nazi guards appeared, and that they divided into two groups. One group rounded us up, and the second group made its way onto the barge we had just jumped off. And we heard incessant shooting taking place on the barge, indicating something which I have since, by reading, been able to verify, that everyone left on the barge was shot. And of course, hearing these shots, we thought, without any doubt, once they'd lined us up, they would shoot us likewise, and that would be the end for all of us. But instead, they lined us up into a group, and they marched us into a nearby town, which I now know to be Neustadt, and they marched us into a very large military compound in that town, and on what appeared to be parade ground or some open area, we had to stand, and most of the guards disappeared. A few remained behind, or other guards from the local military compound took over to guard us. And we stood there for at least 2 hours, possibly longer, during which time we witnessed a very severe air raid taking place. We saw bombs dropping, we saw plane-to-plane air fights. And I recall, sort of praying is probably an overstatement, but wishing as hard as I could that one of these bombs should hit our barge so that they could on no account put us back onto that barge. Eventually the air raid ended, and soon after the guards returned, and they again lined us up into a column and told us to march. I have no idea whether they took us along the same road on which we had arrived, but anyway, they marched us onto a road. And of course, exactly as on the first day, which I think I omitted to mention, as soon as we left Stutthof, anyone who didn't have strength to keep pace with the march and began trailing behind was shot, no question asked, and the body just left where it fell. And this was effectively, quite literally, a second death march. As I mentioned to you, this was now, I believe, day 7, since we had been given that chunk of bread when we left Stutthof. We had nothing to eat or drink since for 7 days. And we weren't exactly in good condition when we left Stutthof after 3.5 years in the camps. Anyone who didn't have the strength to march at the pace required to keep up with the column, as soon as they began trailing behind, one of the guards would shoot them in the back of the head, and as they dropped, they were left. We had been marching for some time when a tank column came towards us. And as this tank column came a little closer, the guard, who, as I said moments earlier, had been killing people for the crime of not being able to march at the pace they wanted, suddenly turned and ran for their lives. And a huge cry of joy went up from our column. We are free, we're free. And indeed we were. But that tank column had not come to liberate us. They did not stop. They presumably had orders to reach some other destination. And that is exactly what they did. I believe that they had liberated us by pure chance, by choosing to travel along the same road that we were being marched on, and thereby scaring our guards into running and leaving us unguarded. So we were now free, totally at a loss at what to do next. People just sat down and didn't know what to do. We still had the fear that possibly guards might turn up again now that that column had disappeared. But very soon after, trucks containing British soldiers appeared on the scene, and they stopped. There was difficulty communicating. I'm not sure, I didn't attempt to take part in any of this, but that they obviously understood who we are because we had been wearing these striped convict type clothing, with which I think everyone was familiar. And they either had with them or they called up truckloads laden with food. They opened the backs of these trucks and handed out food sort of indiscriminately. Everyone could come again and again and take arms full of bread, cheese, tinned meats, sardines, all sorts of food that they were handing out. And some people, understandably, having been starved for years, started gorging themselves, and the body violently objected to this food. It was unable to digest it. And some people fell very seriously ill, and I believe several people lost their lives as a result of this. My mother and I, possibly because my mother had some sort of inkling on what might happen, we stuffed ourselves with bread. But when I say stuffed, I really do mean stuffed. Probably more than we normally have in a month in the camp. We stuffed down that afternoon. Well, they gave us a chance to rest, and then these British soldiers gently marched us back into the town we had just left, Neustadt. And quite incredibly, they marched us back into that same army compound. I've since heard that it was a naval training school, that they marched us into this compound, but instead of, as in the morning, sort of having to stand to attention on the parade ground, all the residents, the soldiers who had been living in this compound, had apparently been taken away as prisoners of war, and we were housed in their accommodation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, effectively was the sort of unspectacular but miraculous way we were liberated by what appeared to have been pure fluke, chance, luck, or if one is a believer, it may have been decreed high above that we were to survive, and in that manner we were liberated. Well, I could go on to speak about my post-liberation life, but I think that's not what I'm here for. That this, I think, is really focusing on death marches. Well, I've given you, to the best of my ability, an overview of our last 7 or 8 days from Stutthof to Neustadt. And I hope that I've met your expectations in speaking reasonably clearly.
Thank you, Manfred. Thank you very much for your time and for telling us about that. I mean, it's really an extraordinary story, I think. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. But I think it's worth stressing for people listening that when Manfred talks about the barges that they were loaded into, the port was at Nickelswalde, just outside, or the closest port to Stutthof. We're talking about river barges, these huge flat-bedded vessels that didn't have engines. So they were not designed to be used on the sea at all. They had to be, each of the barges, and you could see the names of them on the map that Imogen put up, each of the barges had to be tugged. So there was a tugboat associated with each one that pulled them out to sea. And the journey, of course, I mean, what the description given by Manfred of everybody being packed in is reminiscent of slave ships, I suppose. And you can see this journey is really an absurdity for vessels such as these barges. It's absolutely not what they were designed for. And I mean, for me, listening to this, I find it astonishing that anybody survived. But for people who are interested, there's a report that has just been written by Terkel Streda and a couple of colleagues based in Denmark, which has just been published by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I think Imogen can probably post up the link to it, where we've pinched a couple of these maps from, and which goes into a great detail about the journeys taken by the barges and what happened thereafter. So he talks about the trial that was held by the British of some of the perpetrators in 1946 that I didn't know about, as well as going into enormous detail on the basis of the available source material of who was in charge of the different vessels, which groups of camp inmates were on which barge, and so on and so forth. So it's highly recommended. It's a really important presentation on this very little known aspect of the history of the Holocaust. Okay, I see there are a few questions coming in now. Manfred, if you're happy to answer a few of these. The first one is from Mitchell Grubler, which is, what were your mother's jobs? Jobs in inverted commas. What were your mother's jobs when in the ghetto and in the work camps?
In the ghetto, my mother worked in a factory producing army uniforms, German army uniforms. But I believe in other factories, they manufactured bullets. And I'm not sure whether it was in Riga or one of the other camps. I was told that in one factory, they actually manufactured parts for planes, for aeroplanes. So it was all focused on producing items which the Nazis could use to support their war effort. And I've also been told, I believe it to be true, that many of these factories were not there by chance, but that German industrialists had been persuaded by the Nazis to erect these factories on the promise that they would have an unlimited supply of slave labor. So these factories didn't just happen to be close to these various camps. And I understand there were dozens, if not hundreds of them, close to many of the larger camps in the East.
Thank you.
Riga was the only camp in which my mother worked in a factory. From then on, the next camp in Preču, as I told you, we worked out in the open, repairing bombed railway lines. And then in the next camp again, and in Stutthof, the last time we were in Stutthof, there was no work at all. Sorry, I interrupted you. I beg your pardon.
No, I interrupted you. Thank you. Thank you, Manfred, for that answer. A couple of people have asked for the report that I mentioned. I only have it as a PDF, and we can probably put that up. I'll do that in a moment. Manfred, one person, Terry McEachin, is asking you to say something about your post-war life. So I wonder if you'd like to tell us a little bit about how you came to the UK and then what?
Okay. You mentioned early on that my father was arrested by the Nazis. My mother very courageously at that time contacted the office responsible for these deportations to the camps and pleaded for my father's freedom. And she was told that they would permit him to leave the country if he had an entry visa to another country. Well, she tried, made many attempts, all unsuccessful. Visas were just unobtainable. The world was totally indifferent to the fate of these persecuted Jews. A few countries, including the UK and the US, did have limited visa quotas, but they made it very, very difficult to obtain one of these visas. One had to meet very stringent conditions. I believe that in 1938, there were more than 300,000 names on a waiting list for visas to the USA. They had an annual visa quota of 30,000. And to give you an indication of how difficult they made it to obtain one of these visas, I understand that with 300,000 applicants, they only issued 27,000 visas in 1938. In other words, not even filling their annual allocated quota of visas, because very few people could actually meet such stringent requirements to qualify for a visa. Well, then my mother finally, as a last resort, applied to the British consulate in Berlin. She had the good fortune to speak to the chief passport officer. Time does not permit me to go into details, but I can tell you that we have since found out his name was Frank Foley. Some of you may have heard of him. If you have not, if you go online with the name Frank Foley, you'll be rewarded by a heartwarming story. He was a gentleman with a heart. He was actually a British spy, and the passport officer position was a cover for his spying activities. Well, I'll leave you to find out the rest if you're sufficiently interested. Well, after our liberation, both my mother and I fell ill, spent some time in hospital. This was a German hospital, but now under British Army occupation. Eventually, we were released, but sent to a German convalescent home, where we were interviewed by a welfare officer who asked us whether we had any close relative anywhere with whom we would like to be in touch. We gave what sparse details we had of my father. Incidentally, when my mother received the visa entitling my father to enter the UK, she was also given a promise by this Mr. Foley that within a matter of 6 to 8 weeks, he would be able to give visas to the rest of the family to join my father in the UK. But unfortunately, 2 weeks after my father left, the war began and we were now trapped in Germany. And as a result, we were separated for 7 years. As I said, this welfare officer took the sparse details, but said, leave it to me, we'll track him down, we'll find him. It took about 3 months or so, and they did locate my father, who then immediately applied for permission for us to join him in the UK. It took some time, but we arrived in the UK in September 1946, and we were reunited. It was a bittersweet reunion because my younger brother, of course, had been murdered in the camp. Neither of my parents really ever came to terms with it. And although my father was a pauper, he had actually volunteered for the army. He had been arrested in the UK initially as a potential enemy alien, and was also stuck in a camp, an old army, British Army camp known as the Kitchener camp. And after he'd been there for the best part of a year, not mistreated in any way, they were treated well, but they were restricted to that camp. I think in a group, they could periodically go into the nearest town to watch a film sometimes, but they were not allowed total freedom. And eventually, they were given a chance to volunteer for the British Army. They had formed what was called the Pioneer Corps. And my father volunteered, and in fact, he served in the army for several years. So when we arrived in 1946, my father was literally a pauper. Nevertheless, I think primarily at my mother's insistence, they deprived themselves of many things in order to give me a chance to have some private tuition to attempt to catch up on 7 years lost education. In Germany, as a little boy, I had attended a Jewish primary school, which soon after Kristallnacht, at the end of 1938, was closed down. And in fact, any Jewish child attending a non-Jewish school was expelled. So there was no education for any Jewish child after the end of 1938. And in my case, that lasted until we arrived in the UK in 46. I was then aged 16, and I was too old to attend any British school. So whatever tuition I received had to be financed privately. I agree. I attended sort of a grammar college for 3 terms, but then I could not bear the knowledge that my parents were really depriving themselves of necessities in order to pay for this. So I began taking dead-end jobs. Eventually, I decided that my interest lay in the electrical field, and I became an electrician's mate. I had to carry his tool bag from job to job, as was the usual routine, but I was lucky in that he was a very lazy man who enjoyed smoking a pipe. So when we got to a job, instead of him doing the work and me handing him the tools, he would sit and smoke a pipe and tell me what to do, and he was watching me and correcting anything I did incorrectly. So I learned a lot in a short time. But I then decided that I really wanted something a little more challenging. And friends told me, yes, sure, you can study electricity, go to university. When I applied, I wasn't accepted. So I had to spend time working towards obtaining a qualification which would enable me to apply, which I did eventually. And 8 years later, I was at university and I ended up obtaining an electronics degree, a Bachelor of Science degree in electronics. And this became my field of earning a living later on. I married a wonderful lady. Incidentally, later this week, we celebrate our 60th wedding anniversary. And I'm not in the least embarrassed to tell you that I still bless the day she said yes to me. We've had a very, very happy marriage. We have children, grandchildren. We're eagerly awaiting great-grandchildren. And I am forever indebted and grateful to this country, not only for admitting me, but for enabling me to sort of catch up effectively. My real life began age 16 when I arrived in this country, and I've had a life of freedom, contentment, satisfaction, and great, great joy from observing our grandchildren grow up into adults. And sort of deep down, if nothing else, I consider that in living my life in this manner and building up this wonderful family, I have effectively had my revenge on the Nazis. I could go on speaking, but I hope I've given you sort of sufficient insight into my life since then.
You have. Thank you, Manfred, and many congratulations to you and your wife. It feels like after what you just said that's an appropriate time to end. But I wonder if I could just ask you one more question, because
Sure.
if it's not too difficult, because you've mentioned your younger brother a few times.
Yes.
And I've seen the clip of you at the ceremony for the unveiling of the Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could say something about your post-war search for what happened to your brother.
Well, yes. In the camp, it was in the camp of Preču, the second camp, where I was age 13 and I had to go out with that slave labor gang working on the railways, and 4 young children, including my little brother, were permitted to stay in the camp. And we would leave them as we went off to work every morning and be reunited when we returned. After we had been in this camp only for a matter of a few weeks, we returned from work one evening and the children had disappeared. Eventually, one of a handful of people who were in this camp, it was a labor camp, and quite literally, in order to stay alive there, you had to labor. There was just a handful of people who were in the camp during the day, working in the camp kitchen, preparing some sort of broth for us to we handed out when we returned from our day's slave labor. And one of these people told us that that day 2 SS officers had come into the camp, said they had orders to pick up these children and had taken them away. In the camp, of course, that there was nothing we could do. In fact, life was so cruel that my heartbroken mother, I can still hear her wails, having lost her little boy, had to line up the next morning and go out to work as though nothing had happened. It was only post-war that we began searching for some information. I know people kept saying that the Nazis kept records, detailed records, even of people they murdered. And I found out later that quite a number of friends who had come here with a Kindertransport, for instance, and lost their parents by them being sent to the camps, managed to find details not only of the name of the camp, but actually the date they were murdered. It was all recorded by the Nazis. But in my brother's case, we've been absolutely unsuccessful. To this day, whenever we ask for a search to be made for details, and we give whatever information we have of my little brother, they come back with information on me. My sort of experiences and movement from one camp to another appear to be recorded, and they come back giving me details. And I know what happened with me, but there's absolutely nothing we have ever found relating to my brother. The day he was taken away was the day he disappeared off the face of the earth. And the assumption must be, from what I've told you, that the Nazis had no use for non-productive Jews. It is very doubtful that these children survived the day they were taken away. So in other words, we've not had any real closure. We've not found anything recorded anywhere.
Thank you, Manfred, and I'm sorry to ask you to talk about that after what you the happy memories that you've just been sharing. But I thought it was important to honor your brother's short life as well. So I think with that, it's probably coming to time for us to close this event. So I'd just like to thank Manfred very much for a wonderful talk. It's really been a pleasure to have you with us. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague from the Wiener Holocaust Library, Dr. Christine Schmidt, to close.
Thanks, Dan. I just want to say, of course, on behalf of the Wiener Holocaust Library and our partners in the Holocaust and Genocide Research Partnership, I wanted to thank you, Manfred, for speaking with us today and for describing your extraordinary experiences. And I think even in this sort of short amount of time that we had together today, I think we gained a much deeper appreciation for the different ways these forced evacuations were carried out, always on foot. And I feel very, very privileged to have been able to meet you and hear from you both today and yesterday. And I do hope that you'll be able to visit the exhibition and that Dan, Imogen, and I can meet you in person. So we'll be in touch. Hopefully we can arrange that. And I would also like to thank the Holocaust Educational Trust for their help with this event, and to Imogen and Dan for organizing and chairing. And finally, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. I hope you'll be able to visit the exhibition if you haven't done so already before it closes at the end of August. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.